All right, we're live. Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Negin Nazarian. I'm the chair of the 2022 virtual conference, as well as the 11th International Conference on Urban Climate, which will be in Sydney in 2023. And together with my co-chair, Associate Professor Melissa Hart, we would like to welcome you to the very first virtual poster session that is hosted by the International Association of Urban Climate, as well as UNSW Sydney. I'm a CNTA Senior Lecturer Assistant Professor at the University of New South Wales, and today I'm joining you from Sydney, Australia, on a wintry day with fully clear sky and 24 degrees C, and we really hope this is the weather when we welcome you next year, just around the same time in Sydney. So feel free to tell us in the chat option, share with us where you're joining from, what is the weather like. We want to see who is here today in our international community, and we're sure that we're going to see a lot of different weathers, different locations present here with us. I'm also coming to you from the unceded land of the Bejugal people, the Aboriginal Australian people who are the traditional custodian of the land on which the UNSW campus is located on. So I'd like to use this opportunity to acknowledge their custodianship and also pay my respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And this is a very international community, and if we happen to have Aboriginal, Indigenous, or Torres Strait Islanders present with us, we extend this respect and acknowledgement to you as well. Okay, so I'm going to quickly pass it on to my co-chair, who's going to give us a little bit of introduction in the story of this virtual conference, as well as our future events. Melissa, all yours.
Thanks, Negin. So as you're all aware, the pandemic meant that we had to postpone our 11th International Conference on Urban Climate twice, but it will now be next year in 2023. However, to ensure ongoing engagement in our community, we're proud to present this virtual event, which is going to provide an opportunity for our community to come together in this interactive virtual space to share our research. So over the next 3 days, in addition to over 170 posters, you'll have the opportunity to hear from 6 keynote speakers from all around the world, presented across 3 sessions and across multiple time zones as well. So hopefully it fits in with all of us. The first of which will start in a matter of minutes. We also have 3 professional development sessions that have been purely organised by our early career researcher members of our community. So we'd very much like to thank all of the members of the organising community for helping us put together this event. A couple of housekeeping notes before we do start our keynote. Please note you can ask questions using the Q&A panel on the right-hand side of the screen. There are 2 options over there. One is a general chat where you can share housekeeping or general notes or the weather and location where you're currently at. And the second is the official question and answer panel where you can ask questions and you can vote up questions that others have asked before you. So we ask you during this keynote session to use that second option for your main questions so that your colleagues can then vote for the questions they'd like to see answered or see if similar questions have already been asked. The second note is that this presentation will be recorded. If you have any concerns regarding recordings, please let us know. And lastly, we've enabled closed captioning, so we hope that that is useful for you. I'm now going to pass back to Negin to introduce our session, but I look forward to welcoming you all next year in sunny Sydney for our much awaited in-person IAUC 11. Thanks, Negin.
Excellent. Thanks for the housekeeping notes and also a little history of our event, as well as the news of the IAUC 11. So we're going to kickstart our first keynote session right now, and the first session that we're going to have is focused on an increasingly important topic in our field, which is urban climate justice. For decades, the urban climate community has aspired to identify, quantify, monitor, and also eventually address urban climate challenges. And these challenges range from heat, air pollution, rainfall, high impact weather, and climate extreme. You're going to hear all about those during our poster sessions. But what has become increasingly evident is that these problems are affecting urban populations disproportionately. there is currently evidence that countries, communities, population, and individuals that are traditionally disadvantaged are also likely to experience more and more climate challenges. And at the same time, the climate response, recovery, and adaptation plans are also likely affected by these inequalities. So today we are joined by two experts in this field who are going to talk to us about the use cases, principles, and also different methods of quantifying and addressing urban climate justice. So I'm really pleased to announce our speakers. First up, we have Associate Professor Gina Ziervogel from the Department of Environmental and Geographical Science at the University of Cape Town, South Australia. Hi, Gina. We're really happy to have you. Just noting very quickly before you
Not
go into
South
your
Australia, South Africa.
Oh my God! It's all those bad habits of introducing national colleagues, and then now that we're after COVID, we need to come out of that and try to do better with international. Thanks for correcting me. South Africa, really far from South Australia. So Gina's research is focused on climate change adaptation and development across scales from household to municipal levels, with a focus on water, urban governance, and resilience issues. So from South Africa, we have Gina, and the screen, the floor is all yours. We're really looking forward to hearing your talk.
Wonderful. It's really great to be here, and thank you for all joining, and it's an honor to be presenting in this first session. So I wanted to, first of all, I'm in Cape Town, and actually it's a sunny day. So it was pouring yesterday, but it's 7 o'clock in the morning. So it's just getting light, but maybe 8 degrees Celsius, so a little chilly, but hopefully it'll warm up in the middle of the day with some sunshine. So I'm going to be talking about this theme of interdisciplinary solutions for equitable outcomes in the urban context around climate justice. So I just wanted to start with a bit of sort of context of, I know many of you will be familiar with these kind of themes, but some might be less so. And a really useful review paper came out recently looking at equity in human adaptation-related responses, a systematic global review. And in that, they say the climate adaptation responses that do not incorporate equity considerations may worsen inequality and increase vulnerability. So it's really a concern if we don't look at equity and justice issues, because it can make the situation worse. And unfortunately, we've seen many adaptation responses that have actually increased vulnerability, and I'll get to that in a minute. But when they did this review, they had 7 themes that they were looking at, and one of them was cities. And unfortunately, when they looked at cities, in this category, in this theme, there was the lowest number of articles addressing equity and inclusion of marginalized groups. And now that's really a concern for me, because the cities that, the city that I live in, Cape Town, has very high levels of inequality. And the reality is many of our cities in the world have high levels of inequality, where some people have access to services and some don't. So we really need to understand climate risks and those that are most at risk, and how they are being impacted by these adaptation responses. Are they benefiting or not? And we haven't asked that question sufficiently. When they looked at equity issues, income-based inequity was the topic that was most frequently considered, and there really wasn't much looking at gender, age, etc. So this really speaks to the idea of intersectionality and the importance of understanding these multiple aspects of vulnerability when we're trying to understand what the impacts of adaptation are. Mark Pelling and Matthias Garschagen wrote a paper in Nature in 2019, and the title is "Put Equity First in Climate Adaptation." And they said that adaptation must meet the needs of the poorest directly, putting them at the center of decision-making with funding. And I've been working in this field for a few decades now, and it's just very concerning for me to see how infrequently the poorest have their needs met in terms of adaptation, and they're not at the center of decision making, and there's not funding. It's starting to change, absolutely, but it needs to change faster, and there needs to be support for this. And they put forward 3 axioms that we should be guided by. And I think these really make sense, and I'm sure many of you will agree with them. We need to invest in relationships, that's central. We need to understand the local context, support local innovation, support what's happening at the local level, because that is often suited to the local needs. And then we also need to measure success in the most vulnerable, and we need to measure success in creative ways. So just looking at urban adaptation specifically, I just wanted to draw on 2 papers that highlight some of the concerns that I've mentioned as well. So a paper by Chu et al. That looks at strategic urban plans in 3 cities really cautions us that if we don't understand the plans holistically, we're actually going to undermine inclusive development. And one of the things that they saw was that entrenched political interests actually undermine the responses. And myself and Chandni were both authors on the IPCC report that has recently come out, Working Group 2. And I was in the city settlements and infrastructure chapter, and it really, it was hard to often find material on the political aspects of adaptation. So I'd really urge some of you who are interested in that to make sure you follow that up or encourage students to do that. We need to understand these political issues that can really undermine some of the efforts that we might think are good in principle. And then another very useful paper by Isabel Angelovsky and colleagues looks at 8 cities where they specifically look at land use planning. And unfortunately, what they see is that many of the interventions negatively affect the poor. So not even neutral, but actually often the elites are prioritized, and that has really negative impacts for poor communities. So that's really something we need to understand better, because unfortunately, the elites often have a stronger voice. So in terms of the importance of having an interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary response, we need to understand responses holistically. And so these types of projects, programs, policies that really take a more holistic understanding are important. Malloway and Ashcroft state that framings of adaptation process lack a substantive connection to the sources of systemic injustice. And I really like this quote, because so often I've seen adaptation responses, maybe, there's the intention to understand inequity and injustice, but without understanding the systemic injustice, it's very hard to have an impact. And so this idea of transformative adaptation, I think, is important. How do we contribute to more just and sustainable systems? And to do that, I would argue that we do need these interdisciplinary approaches. We need to come from multiple disciplines and sectors and collaboratively ask the questions. We need to have engagement from groups across, from marginalized to elite, that we all are sitting at the same table, listening to each other and trying to figure out ways together. And from my experience, this is not how local government works. That is often in sectors. And I know in Cape Town, it's often quite hard for the city officials, they don't really have good processes to engage marginalized groups. So unpacking urban resilience through multiple perspectives is important, because this does help us to understand some of the responses to complex problems from these different viewpoints. Where are people coming from? How do they experience the reality? And that is important. And so collaboration and co-production is something that I'm sure most of you are familiar with. It's becoming more widespread. But it takes investment. It takes a certain type of group of people. It requires certain funders, but it does help to create broader understanding of the issues. It helps to create buy-in, which is very important. And one of the things I've been arguing for recently is the importance of community-generated data. I think this is one type of data that we're seeing can really help us to understand the bottom-up perspective, and that's a critical part of social justice. But in one of the examples I'll mention, it's quite hard to integrate this data into broader city work often. So I'm going to talk about 2 projects. The first one is called Fractal, and this is a project that the University of Cape Town, CSAG, the Climate Systems Analysis Group, led with funding from IDRC and the UK foreign funding. And there was actually many years of frustration, and there were some really skilled climate scientists who were involved in this, but then there were also people who wanted to undertake co-production. So they worked in many of these Southern African cities, and actually the key cities were Windhoek, Lusaka, and Maputo, but there were many of these other cities who also were part of it. And the types of things that they did were these learning labs where there was continuous linked activity through the 4-year process, where this group of actors in the city, both the people responsible for kind of environment, for housing, for many other aspects, and stakeholders external to the city, came together to think through the issues. And what they did is they said, we're looking for burning issues in these labs. And so the local experts in these multiple different fields could put forward what were burning issues for them, so that there was that energy and enthusiasm to continue. Climate risk narratives was something quite innovative that came out of it, these wonderful climate stories that were much more accessible to the stakeholders in these cities than the downscaled climate models. They also used the concept of embedded researchers, where researchers were employed full-time in the city, and this helped with this kind of research, practice, collaboration and networks to undertake this type of work. And so it really was based on the principle that everyone has expertise and different understandings and types of knowledge. And what was good is the climate scientists and the natural scientists were really one of many. And so trying to look at power issues, rebalance that, whose knowledge counts, was really important. And that then, of course, helped to build trust. But also, we didn't shy away from recognizing that there will be differences in understanding and what people think is important, and that that is actually something that we need to work with and not try and always have consensus. I then have run a project over the last few years in Cape Town, very much an action research, community level project. And as a group of academics, we really wanted to understand water issues in low-income areas emerging out of the Cape Town drought that was very significant and extreme. And I did a lot of work with the city government to understand the governance of the drought, but I really wanted to work with NGOs and local actors to understand more at the local level. And one of the things I was interested in was community-generated data. And I worked with an NGO and a social movement, the Western Cape Water Caucus. And the Water Caucus really wanted to collect better evidence to support their advocacy work. So they were very keen on this project to build their capacity and to feed into the work that they were doing. They've been working on water issues for 20 years in Cape Town. And so in terms of the workshop process, we had this these 2 4-day workshops that really were co-designing process to try and think about the questions and how we would collect data. The people from the caucus then went out and they were the story collectors, and these people are activists who are living in low-income settlements, so they were the researchers essentially. And we then, once all the data had come in, and there were over 300 households who told their story, we had a 4-day process to look at the data, think about story returns and bring some external actors into the last day of that workshop to start sharing the results. We then shared the stories back in the communities and worked with the City of Cape Town to try and engage further on these issues. And just to mention the methodology, we use this tool called SenseMaker, and it's a very interesting tool that I don't have time to go into today, but essentially we ask for a story, and then we ask the person who gives the story to make sense of the story themselves. So, for example, we might say to them, in your community, resolving water problems normally requires bypassing the law, working within the law, or working through informal channels. And they can put that blue dot wherever in that triangle they feel fits best. So it's really a wonderful, rich tool to get both qualitative and quantitative data. And so I just want to show you one of the questions and some of the answers. So when we asked about addressing service delivery problems, we can see that the positive answers, talk to someone and get help, was really a very small number. 14% said they could talk to someone and get help. Most of them battled, didn't know who to call, couldn't reach anyone, couldn't get help. But one of the positive stories was, wow, to you guys. Yesterday, I woke up in the morning and found our tap's head was gone and water was flowing out. I tried to stop the water by sticking a pipe in it. Just to mention, this is a stand pipe in a local area, so this person wouldn't have water within their house. It would be outside their house. I called our municipality office and reported it. They came to fix it on the same day, replacing the old tap with a new one. And I was so happy to see that they are there for our problems and sort them out with no delay. Unfortunately, the majority of the problems are more negative. This person says, fed up with council's empty promises. I have no faith in the council as my complaints fall on deaf ears. I have a blue water meter, which measures daily amount of water used or only allocates you 350 liters a day. And it has not been working properly since day one. I have reported it many times and was, I can't see that because my screen sharing things over that. Disappointed that it will not be seen to. I kept leaking water and my water allocation would run out quickly. And these are the types of stories people are sharing. So we had these outputs from the workshop. There were role plays, discussions to process findings and shared, importantly, with the communities where this data was collected and with research participants. But what was really important for us in terms of sort of climate justice is the activists were owning the study. They were building their skills. They were taking this material forward. We supported them a lot. I got somebody to make a documentary, and I really suggest looking at it. It's a wonderful 17-minute documentary, and there are 2 shorter versions where you can see and hear from these people themselves, so please have a look. And I also worked with Gemma Sue in Australia, and we developed a comic that captures the story. There are 5 stories in there from 5 different countries, and this is something that's very exciting to share in South Africa as a new means of climate communication, capturing these stories. We've got a lovely map called Water Stories, where some of these stories are on that map, and the reports and flyers were used by the activists to share more widely. It's part of my interest, theoretically, is that we need to understand multi-level governance between neighborhoods and local government better. And so the City Water Department did present, were present at the workshop and are very interested in this work, but so hard to get this kind of data into city water decision making. And we need this type of information to inform city responses to water, yet it's really hard. But there have been some dialogues going forward that the city and NGO has been taking forward independently. So just to wrap up that case study, this paper that we wrote coming out of it really emphasized the importance of the knowledge creation phase. Often in adaptation, we jump to implementation, which is really important. But if we want to focus on transformative adaptation and empowered communities and really representing, we need to understand the problem better and bring in these different types of knowledge. And that phase of understanding a shared understanding of the problem is really important. And so in conclusion, we know that addressing equity and justice is actually uncomfortable. And so we need to work more with that uncomfortable space. So we need to confront power asymmetries, find spaces for these different voices. And that's not always easy. We don't want the same voices. We want to take risks. We want to find new approaches. And also listen to what's happening on the ground. What are the experiences physically, socially, emotionally? It's so important to listen and tell stories. And that requires a new type of working, new partnerships and innovation for disciplines, as well as in the sort of transdisciplinary space. So I just leave you with 3 questions. How is equity and justice positioned in adaptation policy and process? Is it there just as an add-on, or is it essential to what is being put forward? And then following through to understand what is actually happening and how are cities leading or lagging? And then lastly, and very importantly, how do those most at risk view the challenge and potential solutions? Thank you.
Thank you so much. I can see that already we have quite a few questions, so we're going to wait on before we are going to move on to our second presentation. Thanks, Gina. We're going to come back. Everyone, don't worry. We'll answer all the questions just in a few minutes after the second presentation. So please join me in welcoming our second keynote speaker, Dr. Chandni Singh, who is a senior researcher at the School of Environment and Sustainability at the Indian Institute for Human Settlement in Bangalore. She works at the interface of climate change adaptation, livelihood transformation, and rural and urban development. We're really happy to have you here, Chandni, today. We look forward to your presentation, and yeah, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Negin, and thanks so much for this invitation. It's really great to follow Gina, because we've been working on other projects together as well as the IPCC, so it's really nice to do this together. Let me just share my screen quickly. Give me a second. Sorry, just a minute. All right, I can't seem to see my presentation now for some reason. Let me do that again.
You always have to deal with some level of technical difficulties when it comes to visual sensing. So otherwise, it would be unusual.
Yeah, all right, I can see it now. Okay. So I'm going to be talking about one particular project that we've been doing in South India, but then also reflecting a bit on this broader idea of how do you think about climate change adaptation in cities and justice elements. So this project, to start off, it was called Recovery with Dignity, and it was a project based in a small state in South India called Tamil Nadu. When I was making this presentation for this conference, I was thinking about this idea of how when we talk about climate change and disaster risk, they seem to be these two separate communities that are doing similar things, but often not talking to each other. And there are lots of lessons in the disaster risk management space that have not carried over, to the kinds of conversations we're having in climate change adaptation, urban resilience, and things like that. So my first big provocation, I think, is just to say that a climate changed world, a world where we are already seeing climate change, is actually one that is increasingly more and more disaster prone. And the way people, you and I, whether or even very marginal communities, experience climate change is through extreme events, whether they're slow onset events like droughts and sea level rise, or more rapid onset events that like floods and cyclones that tend to receive much more attention. So I think it's important to understand that extreme events are kind of the symptoms of climate change. And from the DRR, the disaster risk reduction community, the ways that they understand dealing with these extreme events tends to follow this trajectory of preventing disasters, preparedness to them, providing relief once a hazard strikes, and then recovering from that. So a longer term trajectory. But on the other side, the adaptation community talks of this continuum of moving from coping, which is short-term measures, to adapting, to actually longer-term transformational change, some of the things that Gina also was referring to. So really changing systems and the way systems function. So moving from adapting to transformational adaptation, really. But these hazards, which then become disasters when they impact human populations and systems, are really these moments when, first of all, structural vulnerabilities are laid bare. You kind of see that the existing inequalities in society are suddenly, brought to the fore. And they also are moments when we can see different people have different needs for recovery. There are different agendas that are forefronted. A state might have a certain priority to quickly build back from a hazard versus people on the ground who are impacted by these hazards might actually have very different priorities of what it means to build their capacities and, move towards longer term change. So all of this, when it comes together, the outcomes of that is you really start to see that different people have different capacities to shape the agenda really of recovery and long-term actions to build adaptive capacity. So keeping this context in mind, that disasters are really the stage on which we see climate change playing out, I want to talk about this particular case of Tamil Nadu. It's just to locate it, it's a state in southern India, there on the southeast edge. It's a state that has, it's a litany of disasters is what, every report from the state talks about it being this multi-hazard site. And within that, we looked in particular two sites that have been seeing recurrent disasters. First of all, Chennai, which is the capital city of Tamil Nadu, and the most, I would say, disaster that has been a recurrent memory to whoever you speak to on the field in this part of the country, the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, and then following a series of floods, as well as this part of the world also has a lot of humid heat, which is expected to increase under all, all climate models show high humid heat increases, as well as cyclone intensity going up. And the ways that the government has really said that we are going to reduce risk is through rehabilitating certain people who are affected by floods and cyclones, or actually planned relocation, where you move people away from the coast to reduce their risk. The second site we were looking at is a slightly more rural site, but also with this town, Nagapattinam. It was an area which saw maximum damage after the 2004 tsunami, and then over time has been seeing a series of cyclones almost every year. And what this leads, why I'm laying out this context, is for you to understand that there are sites that, first of all, see a lot of increasing risk, but also these risks and these hazards start coming more and more frequently, and they sort of compound to often come together. So in 2018, there was this large cyclone Gaja, and then after that, straight after that, there was a heat wave. So there are these multiple intersecting hazards that also take place in various places. And again, planned relocation and in situ rehabilitation with the mechanisms that the government used to sort of build capacities, reduce vulnerability, and start off this trajectory of long-term recovery. So the 2004 tsunami was really this moment in India where the national government and various state governments said, all right, we need to do something about managing disasters. We know from the climate change literature that there's a lot more frequency and intensity of these disasters that are going to happen. And so there was this moment as a country where national disaster management guidelines were put into place. But while there was a lot of focus on relief and preparedness, so moving people out of harm's way, there was much less attention really on building adaptive capacity for future climate risks. It was still a very reactive approach. And there tended to be focus on certain types of livelihoods as needing support. So fishers and fishing infrastructure were tended to get a lot of attention, and agricultural laborers, farmland, those kinds of other livelihoods did not get as much. Of course, also another big gap that tends to happen when you think about recovering from disasters and that moment of really showing that there's a lot of action that has to take place on the ground for relief, especially, there's more focus on infrastructural interventions like building houses, providing boats, and much less on actually these softer ways of dealing with risk like psychosocial recovery, which have longer term impacts, I believe, on adaptive capacity for the future. So then from 2004, if we continue, there was this very large flood in 2015, which hit the city of Chennai. And again, it received tremendous national and international media attention because it was the capital city, it was underwater, and the city didn't have any resilience plan at that point in 2015. Unfortunately, this moment of this extreme event was used as an opportunity to continue relocation of low-income settlements. These were people who were considered as squatters in the city, and they were moved away from riverbanks into housing or tenements that were already built by the World Bank and the ADB and so on. And while the pretext was to reduce vulnerability, unfortunately, these tenements came up actually on wetlands in the periphery of the city. So people were being moved from one risk into another risk, often into very poorly ventilated housing. This is a picture that I've taken from my own fieldwork, where you can see that, again, this is a place that is seeing a lot of localized flooding and pooling of water. And people were completely moved away from the livelihoods that they were doing in the city. So there was this idea of a slum-free city, and these people being moved away as a way to deal with both modernizing the city, but also reducing risk. And the risk reduction element was what was forefronted by the government. And then, of course, in the story 2018, we have Cyclone Gaja, another big event, large-scale destruction. And while the destruction was on houses as well as fields like this mango orchard completely devastated, but the kind of relief that was provided by the state, again, was focused more on fishing communities, providing boats, things like that. It sort of, again, did not recognize that impacts are differentiated, and therefore, recovery interventions, but also interventions to build capacities for future hazards also need to be differentiated. And while now the state of Tamil Nadu has this state disaster management plan, which is looking out into 2030, there still is no recognition of the need for having a climate change adaptation plan, having a strategy that is actually forward-looking and looking at multiple risks. The way some of these, so this project that we did was really trying to focus on understanding how do disaster losses and damages get represented? What does that mean for the people on the ground? And then what are the ways that the state is really representing losses and damages? And are these two representations really talking to each other, or are they different? And then what does that mean for building adaptive capacity of people for future hazards? So this is just some clips from various newspaper cuttings of that time, from the tsunami to the cyclones that I mentioned. And overall, we see that often the impacts after an extreme event tend to be in terms of economic impacts, dollar values, this much, the power infrastructure has been impacted in this way. And it tends to be always aggregated, so many millions of rupees or so many houses damaged. And so that the more experiential nature of the disaster, non-economic impacts on people's ability to be part of a community, ability to go out and do their livelihood, those kinds of things sort of get pushed away when we start counting losses and damages because of these extreme events. The second big takeaway, and this was a media review we did, was that a lot of the impacts were spoken about in terms of, in the media, there was a lot of understanding that the impacts are affecting the rich and poor differently. But when it came to policy making and trying to build resilience plans to disasters, there's tended to be this homogenization of everyone is affected equally, and so we need to just roll out certain schemes. So that targeted approach of resilience building was lacking. And then finally, one of the big things that many people talk about is this construction of disasters as often being these calamities that are somehow because of, you can say, an act of God, fury of nature, because of which, or sometimes even people use the trope of climate change to say it's just beyond our control. So disasters as natural, and that often sort of lets the state and other actors who are supposed to build adaptive capacity to avoid culpability. They get away scot-free. So you see that narrative being built in the media, in policy documents, and that's very different from the narrative that you actually find on the ground. So what are the implications of all of this for building resilience and for long-term recovery? Again, we did a detailed policy analysis and of course a lot of interviews. I've been working in this region for the past 6-7 years, but this was a 3-year-long project that we did. And you see that often interventions to deal with disaster risk are around this idea of build back better. So rebuilding something, often they are houses, or there'll be a primary health center or a school in a village or a city, and repairing certain things. And this idea of build back better tends to, as I said, focus on moving people often from housing or places that are considered risk prone to new houses that are considered climate resilient and disaster proof and all of that. But as we've seen in our research, often that is just shifting vulnerability. You're moving people from one place to another without really addressing the reasons why they were exposed to the hazard in the first place. And of course, there's such a focus on build back better, which often tends to be infrastructural interventions because they're very visible, they allow political mileage, and also they allow a state to show that it's acting very fast. Recovery is also something that is often spoken about as being tangible, being visible, as I said, and also fast. The fast acting state is always seen as a state that's doing well. But what you see that often when you build fast, when you provide things immediately after the disaster without having proper participation, proper recognition of different needs that people have, that often tends to not be as inclusive as one would hope it to be. And this again is an example again from Chennai, where people were moved from people who were domestic workers, drivers, carpenters, painters in the city. They were moved away from the center of the city to the peripheries, as I showed in those very precarious housing with poor ventilation, frequent power cuts. And again, they were living in very unsafe conditions. But then when we spoke to people on the ground, and this was one exercise, rounds of exercises actually we did in group discussions with farmers, fishers, and people in informal settlements in Chennai and Nagapattinam, you realize that recovery and building a future that is more disaster resilient, is more climate resilient, actually means multiple things for people. And it's not static, it's ongoing. Lots of people drew futures where they wanted to be able to fish, where they wanted to have a comfortable life, where they had dignified work, and where they had proper cyclone shelters, knowing that there has been so much awareness building on increasing climate risk, that this idea of having shelters during storms and cyclones is something that has come up. Another set of things that people often spoke about, which we didn't see in the recovery interventions that are brought in by the humanitarian sector or by the government, is infrastructure, of course, things like roads and schools and buildings, but also things like trees and shade and groves of forests that used to be there but were totally torn down because of the cyclone. Also, one thing that tends to get left out a lot is many people drew their temple, the photo on the bottom, and actually we did this group discussion while sitting in that temple, which the roof had completely blown off because of the cyclone. And many people spoke about just having a place to get together as a community and do things that they have been doing all along, which is weddings and celebrations and religious events. And that is what recovery meant to them. And the ability to do that is what would help them feel that they were in charge of, or being, or having the capacity to deal with similar events in the future. And then finally, a lot of people, of course, when people are exposed repeatedly to extreme events and also have been historically marginalized, many of these low-income settlements, for example, belong to marginalized castes, work in very precarious livelihoods. So people also develop their own mechanisms of dealing with this everyday precarity. And so there was a lot of, especially after the 2015 floods, there was a lot of civic engagement and mobilization where civil society actors came together to bring people to be able to file cases against this kind of illegal and very hasty relocation of low-income settlements. There was a lot of informal negotiation, either through kinship networks, like either caste-based or livelihood-based networks that people have. So trying to use their social capital to really navigate this post-disaster situation that people were in. And so some of the work that we did in this project was really trying to bring these voices to the fore and say that there are various aspirations and visions of recovery, and that is what we need to understand when we are trying to build the story of long-term resilience for a city like Chennai or Nagapattinam. And so what I'm going to do, this is my last slide to end. I think I want to say that when we talk about climate change, it's so, if you talk to people on the ground, it's something so far away and large an issue that often people don't identify with climate change as something that's there in their everyday life. Disaster events are something that are being experienced as I'm speaking this year. I think India and Pakistan, the whole of South Asia has been terribly, first of all, hit by a series of heat waves, and now Pakistan, 2/3 of the country under flood waters. So disaster events are really these moments where there's a lot of attention. it's almost like a rupture, both socioeconomically, ecologically, but also politically. And it's a space that one can enter and sort of bring about change that may not have happened if things are business as usual. However, disaster events are also this place where certain agendas get foregrounded, and they can potentially, homogenize or aggregate both impacts and experiences, like I was showing in the media reports. And these are these points where we need to really enter and say that when you are thinking about recovery, is it just building back better as infrastructure, so built infrastructure, or is it also thinking about nature-based solutions, about building community and things like that? And really, can we now start to think of recovery as not only just building back from the disaster event, but looking back at structural vulnerabilities and building systems that will allow you to really move towards that transformation adaptation story, where you can build capacities, but really even change systems. And then if we go back to all the literature, and I think Gina laid that out so well about the various literatures that are talking about justice and vulnerability, these are the three ways that I tend to think about organizing research questions, organizing what you want to get out of either research or an action research project, which is that when you are reading or looking at interventions on the ground, to examine whose voice is counting in terms of recognition of justice, what things are being counted, who is driving that counting. Are there particular losses and damages that are really being accounted for while others, maybe non-tangible, non-material ones, are being silenced? And then are histories of marginalization and vulnerability being addressed when we think about these static methodologies often? You go and do your survey, come out, but actually trying to reconstruct the story of marginalization and how it has now led to inequity in this moment of a hazard. The second thing that I always think about, and these are really things for especially students who are in this listening right now, thinking about procedural justice. So what are the procedures that allow, or the mechanisms and processes that allow certain voices to come to the fore while others don't? Whose voices are being privileged? When you talk of participatory interventions, who is really participating? Who is being left out? And of course, because I work a lot on gender and intersectional vulnerability, are there women of different income classes, castes, ethnicities, etc., also coming to the table or not? And finally, this idea of distributive justice. So when you are thinking about interventions and then outcomes of those interventions, it can be anything. I gave the example of floods and cyclones and relocation, but it could easily be heat and urban forestry, urban greening, and the outcomes of that. So who is really able to claim those outcomes, who are further being marginalized, and who's actually facing more loss because of that intervention? And that's what we call often, at least in the climate adaptation space, we call that maladaptation, where you're doing something, but you're having unintended negative consequences for particular people or particular places. That's where I'm going to stop. And if anyone's interested to read more about this project, this is the link. We also have a graphic novel out of this project, it's in English, it's open access, but also available in multiple local languages, because that was what we drew on, these stories that we learned from the field, and then we have taken them back to the participants, and we're using that actually to influence policy. So there are some early steps towards moving away from this very top-down infrastructure heavy idea of recovery and resilience, but a long, long way to go. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Chandni. And I'm going to actually welcome both of you, both Gina and yourself, to come to the stage. If you can please turn on your camera, we can see you. So both presentations were great. Through some use cases, you were able to show us such a complex problem that is not just about the environment and the climate, but it's really bringing the focus to the people that are affected, how vulnerable they are, how are they going to have access or even information to different measures, and what are the aspects of governance and policies that needs to be included. So it is a complex problem, but it looks like we do have some questions that are going to be specific about some different angles of this. And I'm going to actually start one of those, if you don't mind. You've probably have heard the phrase that they say, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And I want to bring that in the context of urban climate justice. Do you agree with this? Do you think what some of the issues that we have with urban climate inequalities is that we have not quantified some of these inequalities that exist when it comes to climate? Or is this something that should take priority? Or you think that based on the use cases you've worked on, that it is one out of many priorities in the field? So Gina, maybe we can start with you.
Great. Thanks. So I think it's a yes and no answer. I think we know enough to act. So we don't need to wait to get more data to act. We are very aware of some of the issues that need to be addressed. But it is important to understand some of these local contexts. So I just want to link this into a question that many people have voted for in the Q&A, linked to my presentation, the examples of community-driven data sets, because I think it is useful to think about that. So, of course, I was sharing about stories of water services and the challenges with those. And the reality is that if the city isn't aware of that, they don't understand the nature of what they need to do to improve that. So how do they improve the experience of these people without that information? And so why is that a challenge? Is there is data that's collected that are stories, and the city has such a quantified data sets, they have their systems, that they don't want to input this kind of data into it because it doesn't align with their way of thinking. And depending on how you define your data and what you're measuring is how you're going to manage it. So without this data, we're not getting management that's appropriate. So in those ways, yes, it's very important. And then also what types of data, of course, understanding vulnerability. But what we're seeing now as well is that people on the ground have access to what's happening at a hazard. You know, Chandni's work about disasters, if you can get that live information from people on the ground. And so there's a lot of tech-based stuff and apps that are helping to collect this. So that's really important as well, because then you can respond in the right places to the right needs, rather than a group of kind of experts thinking they know best when things are unfolding and changing so rapidly. So both and.
I love that response. Thanks. Would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I think just to say, so in this IPCC report that came out, we were trying to assess loss and damage across Asian countries. I was in the Asia chapter. And there's a lot of evidence on economic losses and damages because of climate change. And they are quantifiable, the metrics are relatively clear, and so we could pull that in. But when you speak to people on the ground, it's actually these non-material losses and damages which affect their lives much more deeply and for a much longer period of time. So the metrics around that, we have, I think, good research methodologies to do it, but somehow it doesn't get the same mileage, both in the research community, I feel, as well as in the policy space. So there is a problem there, and there's a lot of, I would say, a knowledge gap there, which I would urge students to fill. And the second thing, I think, again, on temporality. So this is my pet peeve, that we tend to only focus on, when we think of metrics, we will use certain things that provide snapshots of what's happening on the ground. And that's what works well with policymakers, because you can show a quick graph, you can say, this is what the situation is on the field. But the onus is on people like us to really think about more participatory, more longer term methodologies. Life histories is something that I love, where you track back and track forward and try to tell a story that is more close to reality than just this one graph that is sort of expected to summarize people's lives, really. Yeah.
Thanks for that response, and it's actually feeding really well into the second question that we have from the audience. We are asked if we should, how can we prepare a threshold index for climate resilience at the community level? And if you don't mind me, I'm going to actually expand this question and bring it back to what Chandni said, that not just threshold, but like, what are the limitations of the ways that these indices or like these thresholds are defined, and how can we really bring in a way that can tell stories that is beyond maybe economic aspects you said, or beyond the like certain snapshots that is not able to integrate that human experience? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, it really links to the title of the theme for this session on the interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, because I know I had a project where we were trying to measure kind of resilience, and the economist was like, well, we need to have this, this, and this. And the community people were like, but this is important. And it took us so long to find questions that we could ask in a survey format that made the economist happy that she might be able to publish it, but also that we felt captured these sort of more social, cultural issues that Chandni's talking about. And so the problem is when you try and roll that out, you don't have that data. It's not in any kind of, national database because those questions aren't asked. So I often find people will say the adaptive capacity, and you break it down and you're like, well, that could be very broad capacity. Does it really show us how people are and at what point they're going to sort of tip over and really be in a state of stress? So I think I like that question because it's climate resilience at community level. How do you engage community members to reflect on this? And yes, they might not have the research skills, so we're not expecting them to come up with a way to do an index, but we need feedback, we need forums to discuss what makes sense and what doesn't.
If you don't mind me rephrasing, I think it seems to me that you're saying that we need simple methods, but we also need to retain some of those complexities. So just going for like the simplest index that just based on threshold and it's only from one angle is unable to address the problems that we have, especially at the community level. Chandni, anything you would like to add?
Just to add, I think there is, at least in the climate change, vulnerability and now resilience community, this everyone's always keen to use these indicators, make them into a vulnerability index and all of that. And I think we have now moved away as a research community from only focusing on those. So again, there's no harm in using an index, but one thing that I had done in another project of mine, the way you bring those indicators together, I had actually gone back to the community, they did the weighting of what really matters to them, what doesn't, and then you develop an index. So there are ways of sort of valuing these different kinds of knowledge and also what these different types of methods bring to the table. At the end of the day, one is not doing an assessment of vulnerability or resilience to only write a paper, only write a report. It actually has to have make meaning and sort of also reflect reality. So I think finding a way to do that, there are innovative ways that people have done that. So recognizing that is important rather than just coming up with an index that really doesn't lead us anywhere.
And linking to that, I think, historically, indexes and quantitative things has been easier for local government to use and integrate. So it is a bit of a fight for how do we, Chandni and I both talked about stories, comics, ways of sharing things. And, we've got to push more for that because those are the things that can really help people to understand the nub of things rather than a database. So how do we bring both of those to the table and show that they are equally valuable and important?
I think this is also great to have this discussion within the scientific community because I think many of us are trained to work with those data and the more quantitative aspects, but having that in mind that they're just sometimes not enough to capture the whole picture, and we need that extra story to that. I'm going to link this to or expand this discussion and ask the next question. There's asking, both of you mentioned that there are times there are lack of policies or political initiatives when it comes to urban climate justice. What do you think that's happening? What are the key barriers that we don't have these governance or policies at the ground for urban climate adaptation?
Chandni, you start.
God, where are the barriers? I think the biggest thing is that we don't study vested interests well enough. Lots of people, there's so much work, Gina's work, for example, on climate governance and adaptive governance, really. But we tend to, the actors that we talk to tend to be state, national, subnational governments, researchers, of course, we love them. And then other key informant interviews that we do tend to be with maybe people from civil society, of course, people on the ground. But the biggest group of actors, at least in urban areas, who shape the story of urbanization and who gets a voice is places like the real estate sector, So these people with a lot of money, a lot of power, a lot of voice, but not very visible, we don't tend to engage with those. So I think that's a big barrier in terms of, and it's understandable why we don't engage with them because it's difficult to get to them. There are these vested interests which are way beyond any research project. So I think that's one of the big barriers. There's so many others, but that to me is one space that also needs more thinking around how do you engage. For example, just to give you one example of that, in Bangalore, we have a lot where I'm based currently. We have wetlands within the city. And one of the big, and it's a network of wetlands. If they worked well as they used to, they actually cascade from one wetland to another. And so there's no flooding in the city. But over time, there are these large apartment complexes that have been built around the wetlands that have totally, spoiled the whole cascading effect of them. Who builds those? Who lives in those? So there's no real estate, big business builder is really going to stop building those. And they're the rich and elite of Bangalore who live in them. So you can't think about wetland restoration, flood management without dealing with that stakeholders. Yeah.
You
That's
just
great.
naturally answered one of our questions that we had around that. Thank you for that. I know that we're short in time, so if you don't mind me, I'm just going to ask one last question, which I think is actually really interesting. One of the participants has asked, do we think that these adaptation measures that we are discussing, or even the assessment of vulnerability, does it have to be based on each hazard separately, which is what we're seeing now in the field, that maybe some initiatives are only on flooding, others are only on heat, or do we need to focus on the compounding and cascading hazards that are happening when we're doing the overall conversation of climate adaptation?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just start by saying we definitely need both. So building generic capacity is really important, but there are certain hazards that require certain types of capacities, certain ways to respond. And it kind of links to the policy question earlier. Often there are policies in place, but how those are implemented is really hard to see on the ground. And is it building the capacity of those who need it most? So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done there, and we need to be understanding what those and often the generic capacities are basic development. So sometimes in this field, I feel we're trying to do so many things that the development field has battled with for, decades, centuries. So how do we ensure that we pick things, understand some of the key risks, and are things in place for that, and build generic capacity, which helps to address some of the structural inequality that is so important for responding. So it's really about some of those basic needs that we have to strengthen, and then some of the specifics.
Excellent. Do you have any final remarks to add, Chandni?
No, nothing. I can see in the chat people are itching to go to the poster session. So just to say thanks.
Such an interesting topic that I'm sure we can talk for another hour, but unfortunately we have limited time. So I'm just going to use this opportunity to thank both of you, and feel free, all the participants, to use the features also and chat. Thank you again for joining us. We really enjoyed your presentations, and hopefully this kickstart a lot of discussion with our community and future collaboration as well.
Thank you. Look forward to seeing the posters.
Yeah. Bye.